Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Across State Lines. I'm your host, Danielle. Thank you so much for tuning back into the podcast and joining me for episode 13, where we will be discussing the 2020 double murders of brothers Matthew and Philip Reagan. Matthew and Philip were from Ohio, but when Philip got a new job out west, the two brothers decided to make Philip's move into a road trip, where they would travel along historic Route 66, visiting important landmarks and national parks along the way. The two men had specifically wanted to see Spider Rock at Canyon De Chelly, but they hadn't realized that despite all the other national parks in the country being open, the Navajo Nation where Spider Rock sat was closed due to the COVID pandemic. A few days after the men left their homes in Ohio, they would be found dead next to their car, which had been stuck in the mud in Sawmill, Arizona, both having been the victims of a fatal shooting. But before we jump into the case, I want to remind everybody that Across State Lines is available on all podcast streaming platforms, such as Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and anywhere else that you might listen. If you are liking Across State Lines and would like to leave us a rating or a review, it would be greatly appreciated. If you want to leave us any feedback, please visit our website and send us an email. Thank you so much for listening, and now, let's jump into the case of Matthew and Philip Reagan. Matthew and Philip Reagan were two brothers who grew up together in Cleveland, Ohio. In 2020, 39-year-old Matthew was raising his own children, 5 boys ranging between the ages of 2 to 10, with his wife Faye, who was his high school sweetheart. The couple met in high school, and Faye stated that the connection was instant and intense, and they had continued to date throughout college, waiting to marry until after Faye obtained her degree in nursing. Faye described their relationship as very loving and happy, and that the pair grew together both romantically and in life. Matthew was an easygoing, loving father who his sons adored, and he was described as being a very romantic husband, often bringing his wife small gifts just to show her that he was thinking of her. At his work as an HVAC technician, Matthew was known to be soft-spoken and analytical, with his manager saying that he had Jeopardy-like knowledge. Matthew was loyal to his Catholic faith and was in love with collecting watches, hiking, and riding his bike. His wife said that he loved blasting, quote, terrible Irish music in the car and at home, often dancing with his young sons. Faye said that Matthew especially loved spending time with his younger brother, and that the two would often be found in the garage, tinkering on cars. Whenever the family of 7 would go for family outings, Matthew would always invite Philip along. 29-year-old Philip was an adoring uncle to his 5 nephews, and they affectionately called him Uncle Phils. He was described as being full of energy when he was around the boys, and would often build igloos with them. He showered his nephews in candy and presents around Christmas time, and was known to tease them as if they were his own younger brothers, with sarcasm and wit, making them laugh. Philip was known to be very loyal and helpful to those around him, and he had the tendency to always go out of his way for people, and always had a smile while doing so. Faye recalls her affection for her brother-in-law and how she essentially watched him grow up, saying, quote, he was just a little boy, like our little boys, when I first met him. He always had a smile on his face and was really funny, end quote. Philip was employed as a maintenance man at an apartment complex in Cleveland, but just before his death, he was planning a big move to California in order to begin a new job in a new path in life. A friend of Philip's had mentioned to him how an employment opening was available at the Montecito Sequoia Lodge, located in the Sequoia National Forest, and interested in living in a new location, Philip had flown out to California and applied for the position. Philip was soon offered the job as he flew back to Ohio. He decided that he would give the job a shot and planned to work there for at least 1 year. And if he enjoyed it, he considered staying on as an employee for longer. He was equally excited and nervous about this new journey. When Philip accepted his new position in California, that meant he needed to make a cross-country move to relocate. Matthew, wanting to spend a bit more time with his younger brother, decided he would join him on the drive as a form of brotherly bonding. Faye encouraged this decision, knowing how much Matthew was going to miss his younger brother while he was away. The two planned to visit popular tourist destinations along the way and take in the sights that the journey had to offer, following along the famous Route 66. On March 17th, 2020, Philip had dinner with Matthew and Faye, and he was feeling very anxious about his move to California. He had never lived outside of Ohio before, and it made him very nervous. He said to Faye a handful of times that evening, quote, "I'm jobless and I'm homeless, so I have to go," end quote. Philip was thankful for his brother joining him on his long drive, and the two spent the rest of the evening planning out their travel route. They wanted to drive Route 66, and specifically wanted to see Spider Rock and Canyon De Chelly in the Navajo Nation, Arizona. This route would fatefully take them through Sawmill, Arizona, on their way to Spider Rock Campground. In the early morning hours of March 20th, the brothers set out for their trip in Philip's black Ford Escape, with Faye and her sons seeing them off. The plan was that the brothers would go at their own pace out to California, visiting the landmarks along their way, and that Matthew would fly home the following Tuesday. What no one knew at the time was that due to COVID, Canyon De Chelly and all the national parks within the Navajo Nation were now closed and no longer accepting visitors. While the Trump administration and the CDC told Americans that there was no limitations for travel at the time and that people should go about their daily lives, this didn't account for what the Navajo Nation independently decided to do, which was to close their parks for the safety of their community. In fact, all federal parks in the nation were open to the public at the time, except the parks in the Navajo Nation. So Matthew and Philip may not have known that the parks were even closed before they set out on their trip. On the very same day that Matthew and Philip were leaving Ohio, the Navajo Nation issued a stay-at-home order for all residents. Faye mentioned that she had a nervous feeling at the time, but wasn't quite sure why, and ultimately brushed it off, waving as her husband and brother-in-law set out for their trip. On the very first day of the drive, the brothers traveled for 16 long hours, ending the day in Shamrock, Texas. Matthew sent his wife a picture of him and Philip standing in front of the Conoco gas station, the garage that was made popular in the Disney film Cars. He was eager for Faye to show their boys, thinking they would be excited to see it since they liked the movie so much. Faye recalled noticing how tired Matthew had looked, knowing that instead of stopping in Oklahoma as they had planned, they pushed all the way through Texas on the very first leg of their trip. Faye told Matthew to get a good night's sleep and that she loved him and she would speak to him in the morning. The next day, they set out to cross the Texas-New Mexico state line, where communication became spotty and sporadic between Matthew and Faye. It seems the brothers made one quick stop at the Blue Hole in Santa Rosa, a popular swimming destination. Philip and Matthew were pushing to get to Spider Rock before sunset, and they still had a ways to go. At 4:26 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Faye would receive her final communication from her husband, a photo of a train passing through the southwestern landscape. As the evening wore on, that nagging, uncomfortable feeling returned to Faye. She hadn't heard from her husband in hours, but assumed that they may be pushing through New Mexico into Arizona. Around 6 p.m. that evening, Matthew and Faye's 6-year-old son, Patrick, had attempted to Skype his father, but no one had answered. Faye found this unsettling because Matthew had always been good about staying in touch with her and the boys when he was away, and he would never miss an opportunity to say goodnight to the children. 2 hours later, with still no word from Matthew, Faye's worry began to intensify. Faye began to call around to hotels, campgrounds, and hospitals throughout northern Arizona to see if her husband and brother-in-law had checked in anywhere, but no one had seen them, and there was no record of them staying anywhere. Faye tried to calm her nerves despite her anxiety growing. She later stated, quote, "I was like, just wait a minute. They're probably making that last push like they did the night before, and they're probably just getting to wherever they're staying. And then they're going to call you and they're going to Skype." End quote. On the other side of the country in Sawmill, Arizona, a small town in northern Arizona with a population of 706 people in 2020, Matthew and Philip were reportedly last seen alive around 3 p.m. At some point during their drive on Navajo Route 7, passing through Sawmill, their vehicle got stuck in the mud and snow in a ditch about 2 miles away from the Sawmill Express convenience store. The men began to walk in the direction of the store in order to get help with pulling their car from the mud. The men hadn't even made it half a mile into their walk when they crossed the paths of a killer and were fatally shot. A woman who was driving by a short time later to collect firewood discovered their lifeless bodies partially in the roadway and had to drive further into town to get service in order to call the authorities. Navajo police were the first to arrive on scene, noting each man had multiple gunshot wounds, which had been fired at close range. Later, the Apache County's sheriff's office would arrive on scene, where this was deemed to be a homicide. The FBI would take over the investigation, as the men were not Native Americans, and the Navajo Nation is a sovereign nation. A news article describes the situation this way, quote, "When crimes happen on the reservation, the race of the suspects and victims and the severity of the crime determine who has jurisdiction. The brothers were not Native Americans." End quote. Authorities were able to identify the victims as Matthew and Philip by running the license plate from the vehicle through the database, which returned back as registered to Philip. Due to the temperature dropping as night approached and the fact that the sun was going down, police made the decision to halt the investigation for the night and to resume the next morning to search for evidence around the crime scene. When daylight approached, officers were back on scene and noted that it appeared the vehicle had slid on ice and into the ditch, where it had gotten stuck in the mud. Handprints on the car had all come back to Matthew and Philip, most likely due to them attempting to push the Ford Escape out of the mud and back onto the road. No other fingerprints had been found on the vehicle that had belonged to anyone else. They also noted that the vehicle had not been tampered with in any way, that the car was still locked, and that no damage had been done to the vehicle other than from what had occurred when it slid into the ditch. When Sunday morning rolled around, Faye was beyond worried. She began to call her husband every hour on the hour, receiving no answer or reply. When calling wasn't enough, she drove to her father's home, where the two decided that she should contact authorities in Arizona. She headed back to her own home, and while she was preparing to run a quick errand, her doorbell rang. She described the situation like this, quote, "I walked up the stairs into our living room, and I could see the two policemen through the front windows. At that moment, I knew something was terribly wrong. I felt that way for the whole day. I answered the door and talked to them. They were very kind." End quote. The officers told her that she needed to call the Apache County Sheriff's Office in Arizona and that her husband had been found deceased. Knowing that Philip wouldn't have left Matthew, she asked if Philip had been found as well. They again urged her to call the authorities in Arizona. When she did, she learned about the murder of her husband and brother-in-law, something she never expected to hear. She stated that when they set out for their trip, her biggest worry had been that COVID had reached the United States. She never expected her husband and brother-in-law would be harmed in any way. The police stayed at Faye's home while this call unfolded, and sadly, her oldest son was by her side to hear the news about his father. When asked by police if they could get anyone for her, she recalls thinking to herself, quote, "The police asked who they could get for me, and I couldn't even think straight. The person you could get for me is the person you just told me isn't available." End quote. As this happened fairly recently, the investigation into Matthew and Philip Reagan's murders is still ongoing and active, and there doesn't seem to be any word about what has been uncovered so far. Robbery was considered as a possible motive for their deaths, but the motive itself has not officially been determined, and it has been said that nothing was taken from the car or the bodies of Philip or Matthew. It is believed that Matthew and Philip had taken the rural road because GPS had directed them that way, instead of on a more populated road that may have taken longer, and that when their car got stuck in the mud, someone with ill intentions happened upon them. Faye stated that it wasn't like her husband to take such desolate roads, however, and finds it strange that they were so far off the beaten path, with the main highways being quite a far distance away. Authorities working on the case have stated that while the road is quite rural, and it is only paved for a part of the way before it turns into a dirt road, which is mostly used by locals, there have been instances where GPS has navigated other tourists down that road in order to lead them to Spider Rock. With limited leads, police turned to surveillance video that had been obtained from the convenience store in Sawmill. It showed that Matthew and Philip had passed through Sawmill at around 3 p.m. that day, which led them to determine the times of death between 3 and 6 p.m. The surveillance video showed that no altercations between the men and anyone else had occurred at the store, and it didn't appear that anyone had been following them at the time. Police were able to identify and track down any individual who had visited the store leading up to the murder or shortly after and speak to them. One individual they had spoken to had a criminal record, and they felt that he might have been a good candidate as a potential suspect of the shooting. This individual was thoroughly interviewed, and in the end, they determined that he had nothing to do with the murders and was cleared as a suspect. Faye has had a difficult time accepting that her partner of 22 years is no longer with her or her sons. She said that she sees Matthew whenever she looks at her children. She sees him in their spirit, in their cheek dimples, and in their bright red hair. She worries that her youngest son won't remember his father at all once he grows older, but she speaks to her children every single day about their father, reminding them of his deep love for his family. She described the pain of losing her husband, saying, quote, "At home, he's everywhere, but then very sadly, he's not. And that's very hard." End quote. She finds comfort in the fact that the two brothers were together in their last moments and not alone. She wants her husband and brother-in-law to be remembered not for how they died, but for who they were in life before this terrible tragedy unfolded, saying, quote, "They both did so many things with their lives that impacted so many people around them in a positive way, that we don't want the primary thing that they're ever thought about, or when you look at them, is this one single event. There's so much more than how they were killed. They were people that had tons of family that loved them. They had friends. They had coworkers. They have a lot of people that miss them, but then they are also not able to continue those relationships." End quote. 21 months after the death of her loved ones, Faye made her way to the desolate road where her world changed forever. She wanted to see the place her husband spent his final moments, a chance to see through his eyes. She placed 2 wooden crosses at the side of the road, and she used this moment to teach her sons that healing was about forgiveness and not allowing your heart to harden. The FBI has put up a $10,000 reward for any information leading to the resolution in the deaths of Matthew and Philip Reagan. Anyone with information about this case is asked to call the FBI Phoenix at 623-466-1999, the Navajo Department of Criminal Investigations in Window Rock, Arizona at 928-871-7519, or the Apache County Sheriff's Office at 800-352-1850. The FBI is working on the case and have vowed to not give up on it, saying to the Arizona Republic, quote, "We are confident someone knows who is responsible for the murders of Matthew and Philip Reagan. The FBI and our law enforcement partners have logged many hours of investigative work on this case. The FBI does not forget. No matter how much time has passed, we will continue to aggressively pursue this investigation. We are dedicated to protecting all of our communities and to pursuing justice for Matthew and Philip Reagan, their families, and friends." End quote. Now, let's dive into the theories about this case. It doesn't seem like we're working with much at all, as the motive for the murders has never been established, and Matthew and Philip hadn't known anyone in the area of Sawmill. Robbery can't be conclusively ruled out, despite the authorities saying nothing was taken from the cars or the bodies. It might be possible that robbery was the motive from the start, but things escalated and Matthew and Philip were killed and the killer ran off before he grabbed anything. However, this does feel unlikely because if it was the motive of the confrontation, the killer most likely would have followed through with the robbery after Matthew and Philip's deaths. It doesn't seem like the killer should have been overly worried about being seen or caught at the crime scene or staying too long, since it was such a desolate and rural road and the nearest structure was about 2 miles away. In my opinion, this motive seems the most unlikely. Who would have even known that Matthew and Philip would be out there? It was stated that it didn't appear anyone had been following either of the men when they were in Sawmill. The next motive in theory is that Matthew and Philip were possibly in the wrong place at the wrong time, and from reading interviews with Faye, it seems like she feels this is the most likely scenario. Faye stated that she wondered if the two brothers had stumbled upon something that they shouldn't have seen out in the woods, like perhaps a drug deal or something more sinister, and the two men were killed in an attempt to silence them. It's possible that Matthew and Philip's car got stuck in the mud, and as they were making their way back to town for help, they stumbled upon something criminal that was happening, and they were killed for having seen it. So far, there has been no evidence to say one way or another that this was the case. However, the U.S. Department of the Interior states that methamphetamine is prevalent in the nation and that it is the number one drug seized from drug operations in the area. It's possible that the men came upon an illicit drug deal happening out in the woods and away from prying eyes. But again, this can't be said with any certainty. Now, my personal theory on this case, and what I thought of immediately when I first began to research it a few years ago, was that this was possibly a murder out of a reaction to fear. COVID had just reached the Navajo Nation on March 17th, a few days prior to the murders, and once it reached the nation, it spread rapidly. So rapidly, in fact, that it had one of the highest reported cases out of anywhere in the United States. On March 20th, the day that Matthew and Philip left their home to embark on their journey, the Navajo Nation was quickly put under a stay-at-home order. Now, I have no basis for this theory other than that it's my personal thought, but I had immediately wondered if someone from the reservation had stumbled upon the brothers while they were walking away from their car and were angry with the fact that two people, especially outsiders to the community, would break the stay-at-home order and risk spreading the infection to those within the community. I can picture a verbal altercation occurring between the men and someone else that had turned into something so driven by fear that the murders occurred. I haven't heard this theory thrown around about this case before, and it's certainly not any kind of official theory. But to me, due to the circumstances and heightened emotions at the time, this feels the most likely to be what had occurred. Over 4 years have passed since the deaths of Matthew and Philip, and whatever has been uncovered, if anything at all, has been kept from the public, so it's unknown what the status of the case is at the present time. Hopefully, Matthew and Philip will soon receive justice and their killer will be caught. With the town of Sawmill being so small, I find it likely that this case will be resolved at some point, and the Reagans will finally have a small amount of peace, knowing that the person who took their loved ones away will face justice. Thank you so much for listening to Across State Lines, and we will be back next week to dive into another unsolved case. Please follow or subscribe to Across State Lines on your podcast listening platform so that way new episodes will drop directly into your listening feed. If you'd like to rate or review Across State Lines on whatever platform you listen to, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, and join us again next week.